So I'd like to talk a little bit about the what I call the missing link when Jordan Peterson was talking at the Ayn Rand Institute. I think this is the panel discussion, but I don't actually want to play it
That's not a.
because I'm afraid of a copyright infringement. But you can see here it starts at about 43 minutes, and I'm going to refer back to that point in the discussion. And you can see it's hosted by the Ayn Rand Institute. There's the title. So Jordan says, reason starts to look like metaphor, like narrative. And Salmieri says the act of coming up with inertia is something else. So there's something missing. What is the something else? And I think to understand what's missing, you need to know about William Blake's worldview. And you might wonder, why am I drawing on William Blake? Well, if you flip through the notes section of Maps of Meaning, you'll notice many of them pertain to Northrop Frye. And if you look up Northrop Frye, you'll find read Blake or go to hell. That's my message to the modern world. So who was Northrop Frye? And I don't want to read his Wikipedia to you, but I just want you to note that they're both Canadian, him and Jordan. They both have a understanding and connection to suffering, as Frye's brother died in World War I. They both have a connection to science. Obviously, Jordan is a psychologist, and Frye's first cousin was a noted scientist. They both are sort of cultural critics. Frye was ordained in the United Church of Canada, and Jordan, I believe, started his own church online so that he could officiate a wedding, which is kind of comical. And they both have a connection to the University of Toronto. Frye came up with a theory of the imagination, and again, I don't want to read the whole thing to you. You could freeze frame this and read it yourself. But there are a couple of important parts I will read just for emphasis. Mythology and literature thus inhabit and function within the same imaginative world, one that is governed by conventions, by its own modes, symbols, myths, and genres. Integrity for criticism requires that it too operates within the sphere of the imagination, and not seek an organizing principle in ideology. To do so, claims Frye, leaves out the central structural principles that literature derives from myth, the principles that give literature its communicating power across the centuries through all ideological changes. And just notice, they're both talking about language, myth, and ideology, and how all of those can intersect, and Jordan's drawing the intersection to be a deadly one. And Frye thinks that that intersection could destroy the knowledge that we have in myth. For Frye, the story and not the argument is at the center of literature and society. The base of society is mythical and narrative, and not ideological and dialectical. This idea, which is central to Frye's criticism, was first suggested to him by Giambattista Vico. And we're going to have to get into a little bit of that to understand the missing link for Jordan Peterson in that conversation. I have two quotes here from one of Frye's books called The Great Code, The Bible as Literature. And before I get into it, I just want to give you a quick background because Vico does, I believe, come up in one of these quotes. And Vico sort of put forth the idea of there being sort of a cyclical history with three phases, and each phase had a kind of language associated with it. The first age was the mythical age, or the age of gods, and it had a poetic language. The second age was a heroic age, and it had a noble language, and this is where nobles and aristocrats sort of set the tone for what society thought. And the third age was the age of the people, and Vico called that the vulgar age, which has Latin roots in the people. As in the common man, it was explicit and very concrete. So I think I'll read the first quote. I'm going to save the second quote for later because it's going to pertain, you'll understand it better if I read it later. But to give you a good idea of why Frye is so important here, check this out here. Let me see. All human societies are insulated to some degree by a culture that surrounds them and separates them from nature. There are no noble savages in the sense of purely natural men for whom this integument of culture has disappeared. What we live in, says Wallace Stevens, is a description without a place. This description, on its verbal side, is a mythology or body of sacrosanct stories, rituals, traditions, a social skin that marks the boundary between ourselves and the natural environment. In its early stages, it is difficult to separate or distinguish the various aspects of mythology, but as society becomes more complex, different areas of culture, literature, religion, philosophy, history, science, art, become increasingly distinct from one another. The primary function of mythology is to face inward towards the concerns of the society that possesses it, which is why science, which faces outward toward the operations of nature itself, is a late cultural development. And I think what you see there is it's so interesting as it relates to Jordan and, let's say, Sam Harris. Sam Harris is saying science can inform us as a society about our ethics, and it can't. As Fry pointed out there, science points outward towards the natural world. Jordan Peterson is saying we need to look at myth and our traditions to guide us into the future about ethical matters. And I guess Sam Harris might say, well, humans are part of the natural world, and that's why it's valid. But I think that's where the argument will get tenuous. Here's another quote. I couldn't find it online, but I think it's from The Great Code, so I don't know why it's not there. But he says, man lives not directly or nakedly in nature like the animals, but within a mythological universe, a body of assumptions and beliefs developed from his existential concerns. Most of this is held unconsciously, which means that our imaginations may recognize elements of it when presented in art or literature without consciously understanding what it is that we recognize. This is starting, but just as an aside, this is sort of reminding me of Jung and his collective unconscious and the archetypes held within. I think Jung and Fry were writing about the same time. Jung had a few decades head start, but he was, I think, writing primarily in German, so Fry might not have been too familiar with his first published works. Practically all that we can see of this body of concern is socially conditioned and culturally inherited. Below the cultural inheritance, there must be a common psychological inheritance. Otherwise, forms of culture and imagination outside our own traditions would not be intelligible to us. But I doubt if we can reach this common inheritance directly, bypassing the distinctive qualities in our specific culture. One of the practical functions of criticism, by which I mean the conscious organization of a cultural tradition, is, I think, to make us more aware of our mythological conditioning. So doesn't that sound familiar? You can clearly see the language is very similar to what Jordan Peterson is talking about, especially with his discussions with Sam Harris. It seems Fry's thoughts are reverberating in Jordan, amplified in our own times, perhaps even more than in his own. But what was reverberating in Fry, coming through to a new age and a new people? And I think it was clearly William Blake. And here you have his sort of context for his time frame. He was born in 1757 and died in 1827. Here's a couple of quotes that I think are interesting, give you some idea of what Blake is about. And the first one was actually quoted in the second season of Westworld, if you're a fan of that show. To see the world in a grain of sand, and to see heaven in a wild flower. Hold infinity in the palm of your hands, and eternity in an hour. The second quote kind of reminds me of Jordan Peterson versus the postmodernists. If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear as to man as it is, infinite. And I think you can see that right there. You see a little bit of Jordan and a little bit of the postmodernists contained in that quote, and that the postmodernists are saying that there is no set interpretation of anything because there's an infinite number of interpretations. And Jordan is saying, well, wait a minute, we have limits. We have biological and physical limits to our understanding and to our senses, to how we can perceive something. And so Blake says there, the perception, if we didn't have those limits, then we would see everything as it truly is, which is infinite. So Fry's first book was Fearful Symmetry, and it was all about Blake. The first chapter was a case against Locke, for good reason. It was Blake's primary struggle in his time, and we still see the struggle playing out today, I think, between Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris, where Jordan takes the place of Blake and Fry, and Sam Harris takes the place, roughly, of Locke. I'm not going to discuss the first two phases of the history and language that Vico mentioned earlier, but we're going to try to focus on the third phase, since it's the one we're currently in and experiencing, and the one I think Jordan Peterson is actively struggling with. So we're in the vulgar age, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the transition into that age too. It's derived from the people, and Fry renamed it the Demotic Age, I guess, to avoid confusion with that which is profane. Language is explicit. It goes according to common understanding. It's very concrete. It's objectified instead of personified. Now, there's two precursors to this age. One is that syllogistic reasoning was seen to be rather unimpactful, rather illusory, in the sense that the conclusions were often contained in the premises. This form of language started to become unsatisfactory. And just to give you an example, you can see that in, let's say, Descartes, where he says, "I think, therefore I am." His conclusion was contained right there in the premise, and that just doesn't work too well. While the analogical approach suffered from having no way to distinguish existence from non-existence. The lion and the unicorn, for example. The scientific revolution was a second mover towards this third phase. Scientific thought started to assume two levels of sense perception: the accidental, which corresponds to the metaphorical, i.e., sunrise and sunset. The fact that we see the sun rise on the horizon and set on the horizon is purely an accidental fact that we are human beings on the planet's surface. If we were anywhere else, it would look different, and we wouldn't describe it as sunrise and sunset. So, for example, science gives us also the ideal way of perceiving things, which corresponds to a perspective from which the objective world corresponds with perception. So a point in space, say from an astronaut's perspective, that allows you to see the Earth rotate around the sun. Copernicus symbolizes that sunrise is metaphorically sufficient, but descriptively illusory. Darwin, for example, would symbolize that divine creation was also an illusion of evolutionary processes. Einstein symbolizes that the great bastion of the objective world was an illusion of energy. With this, the observer could not be separated from the observed, and so he had to become an object of observation as well, and we're going to get to that a little bit later on too. So explicit language had always existed, but it was contained primarily to matter-of-fact transactions, like records of how much grain was stored and where, or how much money was brought in by taxation in the Roman Empire. Record-keeping was the primary function of that kind of language. But stories were not told this way. The Odyssey and the Iliad are prime examples. Art, the stuff of the highly functioning mind, was in a language that was also highly metaphoric, to express things beyond expression, to extend and surpass the reach of language as it was. The ordering and contents of the words gave no indication of what is and is not. There was a sort of magic in early language where what you said had power over the natural world, and this sort of faded away, and with that so did a lot of meaning, and you could sort of see that as a spiral towards postmodernism. Then if the order of the words couldn't distinguish this, it was not a far leap from understanding that reasoning and rationalizing were indistinguishable. The difference could only be discerned by criteria external to the words themselves, in other words, things, the objects of nature. Thus begins the reign of Bacon and Locke that discern reality by exposing our senses to nature and ordering words to conform to those sensations. Once exposed to the natural order of objects in the world, we reflect on those sensations and produce a descriptive ordering of words to correspond with those objects. This new reasoning is based on experimentation with the senses. You might say it's science. This reflection gives rise to the reasoning that is superior to the former subjective thinking because of its correspondence with the senses about the natural world. It's immediately apprehended and repeatable. It is objective instead of subjective. We moved from the time of Homer, where a word evoked an object, to our own time, where an object evokes a word. And you can see this with Sam Harris saying that the objects of the world present themselves to our senses and that's how we are informed of reality. Or as Jordan says, we meet the objects halfway. We have sense perception, but we also have something else going on when we perceive the world. And so the world is coming at us, but we're also coming at the world. And here I think a second quote from the Great Code might clarify a lot of what I just said. Hopefully I can increase the size of this. In the 19th century, there were many thinkers, mainly of the idealistic school, who adhered to the metonymic tradition with its God. And right here, I'd like you to think about, as I read this, Jordan Peterson answering the God question. Does he believe in God? Is he a Christian? Because Jordan is definitely familiar with Fry. He cites him many times in his books. And he has to be thinking this way. And I think this will clarify some of the way he's answering that question. But some, even of them, give an impression of having said to themselves, here's this word, God. What am I to do with it? What they did was often ingenious, but frequently confirmed the feeling that the conception of God, like biblical metaphors and metonymic theology, was becoming, however unconsciously, a cumbersome piece of traditional baggage. In a conception of language where no premises are beyond scrutiny, there is nothing to stop anyone from returning to square one, and the question, is there a God? What is significant about this is that the answer, if it is to remain within the framework of third phase language, remember that's the sort of scientific, concrete, objectified language, can only be no. The answer can only be no, because any question beginning with is there is, so to speak, already an ungodly question, and a God is for all practical purposes no God. Nietzsche's formula, God is dead, despite the amount of attention it has attracted, was incidental to his more important aim of deifying the natural environment, and in particular of removing the metaphor of law from ordinary consciousness to describe the operations of nature. There are no laws in nature, Nietzsche says, only necessities. But the metaphor law of nature carries with it a vestigial sense of a personality who commands, and other personalities, ourselves, who have the option of obeying or disobeying. And you have to remember that in the time of Copernicus, Newton, and Galileo, they were steeped in a Christian society. And many of them had Christian beliefs, or quasi-Christian beliefs, or deistic beliefs. And so to them, it made sense that there was this overseer who laid out a law for nature. But Nietzsche's correct. If you're a purely atheistic scientist and you're just looking for nature itself, there is no law, only necessity. The political and psychological aspects of third phase writing led to similar positions. One of the earliest third phase writers, Machiavelli, attempted to distinguish and isolate the tactical use of illusion in the art of ruling. For Rousseau, civilization was largely an illusion concealing a society of nature and reason. For Marx, the whole second phase approach to language had become an ideology or facade of ascendant class authority. For Freud, the language of consciousness was largely a screen concealing other motives for speech. And he goes on with some, I love how he cites particular known thinkers as an exemplar of what he's talking about. It's really interesting. What I'm concerned with at present is not the question whether God is dead or obsolete, but with the question of what resources of language may be dead or obsolete. The metaphorical and metonymic phases of language have been in large measure outgrown because of the obvious limitations that they imposed on the human mind. But it seems clear that the descriptive phase also has limitations, and this is what we're getting to with Jordan Peterson. In a world where its distinction of subject and object so often does not work, and you'll often hear Peterson, especially in the Ayn Rand talk, say that when he talks with his patients, he has no choice but to get into this metaphorical, religious type of language. Otherwise, no progress can be made psychologically. And I think this offers some insight into that there are limits to your scientific language. There's no question of giving up descriptive language. Exactly. Jordan's not throwing out science and taking in religion. He's keeping what's useful in science and keeping what's useful in religion. It's very interesting. It's sort of like both and versus either or. Peterson is taking both religion and science together, as I think you should. Whereas Sam Harris seems to say it's either or. We have to make a binary decision. It's either science or it's religion. Where was I? All right. There is no question of giving up descriptive language, only of relating it to a broader spectrum of verbal expression. The word God is a noun, and so falls into the category of things and objects. For metonymic writing, this is not an insuperable problem. What is beyond all things and objects can still be a noun, or at any rate have a name. For most writers of the second phase, God represents an immutable being, set over against the dissolving flow of the world of becoming in which we are. And practically the only grammatical device for conveying this sense of the immutable is the abstract noun. For third phase writing, founded as it is on a sense-apprehended distinction between objects that are there and objects that are not, God can only go into the illusory class. But perhaps this kind of noun thinking is at least here a fallacy of the type that Whitehead calls a fallacy of misplaced concreteness. In Exodus 3:14, though God also gives himself a name, he defines himself as I am that I am, which scholars say is more accurately rendered, I will be what I will be. This is, we might come closer to what is meant in the Bible by the word God if we understand it as a verb, and not a verb of simple asserted existence, but a verb implying a process accomplishing itself. This would involve trying to think our way back to a conception of language in which words were words of power, conveying primarily the sense of forces and energies rather than analogues of physical bodies. To some extent, this would be a reversion to the metaphorical language of primitive communities, as our earlier references to a cycle of language and the primitive word manna suggested. But it would also be oddly contemporary with post-Einsteinian physics, where atoms and electrons are no longer thought of as things, but rather as traces of processes. God may have lost his function as the subject or object of a predicate, but he may not be so much dead as entombed in a dead language. And I think that's right on. I think that's exactly where Peterson is falling with that question. And he may have moved it around a bit and reformulated it in his own way. But I think that sheds a lot of light on that question, and hopefully illuminates some of what I've been saying here. So a lot of this language stuff regarding the third phase and the scientific revolution and so forth, it's sort of been known as the correspondence theory of truth, which in some sense can be traced all the way back to the ancient Greeks, as so much can be. But it's where you have an object corresponding to your sense perceptions, and if you say something is, then there better be an object that is. Pretty self-explanatory. So how does Blake fit into all of this? Blake versus Locke. Blake used Locke, Newton, and Bacon as stand-ins for all evil and tyranny in the world. He saw in their philosophy something destructive. He was almost prescient in his clear vision of what the future held for these lines of philosophical thought. And what you might say is part of the evilness of it is that there is a sort of, in the materialist worldview, there is no sense of free will. And it's the sense that man is not a being, but he's more like a machine, where there's just a bunch of gears turning, and once the gears have started at the start of the universe, everything else swirls into place, and there's no stopping anything. It just all has to be. That's part of the evil tyranny. So I just have a few quotes from Blake, so you can see how he does this. The numbers, I don't know why the numbers are there, but they just kind of formatted that way. O divine spirit, sustain me on thy wings, that I may awake Albion from his long and cold repose. For Bacon and Newton sheathed in dismal steel, their terrors hang like iron scourges over Albion. Reasonings, like vast serpents, enfold around my limbs, bruising my minute articulations. I turn my eyes to the schools and universities of Europe, and there behold the loom of Locke, whose woof rages dire, washed by the water wheels of Newton. Black the cloth and heavy wreaths folds over every nation. Cruel works of many wheels I view, wheel without wheel, with cogs tyrannic, moving by compulsion each other. Anyway, it's fascinating. I will suffer, or will you suffer this Satan, this body of doubt that seems but is not, to occupy the very threshold of eternal life? If Bacon, Newton, Locke deny a conscience in man, and the communion of saints and angels contemning the divine vision and fruition, worshipping the deist of the heathen, the god of this world, and the goddess nature, mystery Babylon the great, the druid dragon and hidden harlot, is it not that signal of the morning, which was told us in the beginning? That the children of Jerusalem may be saved from slavery, there is a negation and there is a contrary. The negation must be destroyed to redeem the contraries. The negation is the spectre, the reasoning power in man. This is a false body, an incrustation over my immortal spirit, a selfhood which must be put off and annihilated away. To cleanse the face of my spirit by self-examination, to bathe in the waters of life, to wash off the not human, I come in self-annihilation, the grandeur of inspiration, to cast off rational demonstration by faith in the Savior, to cast off the rotten rags of memory by inspiration, to cast off Bacon, Locke, and Newton from Albion's covering, to take off his filthy garments and clothe him with imagination, to cast aside from poetry all that is not inspiration. While Locke made human beings into passive receptors of perceptions, Blake insisted that we were always active perceivers. And here I think the example of the camera versus the brain is a good one. If you think of a camera lens as passively receiving information from the outside world, and then you imagine your brain using your eyes as a lens to see the world, to a large extent the images we see require our brains, the images require us, the images require what Blake would say is an imaginer. Thus, imagination for Blake was the key perception and the key to understanding the world. And I think Ian McGilchrist also plays a role in this, as Jordan Peterson does. I would highly recommend his book, The Master and His Emissary, because in it he makes a very strong case, both biological and psychological, for a shift from thinking about humans as beings to something more mechanized, like robots. And thus we get a lot of this kind of thing popping up. The human is turned into a machine, a series of machines. The organic being turns mechanical as we rely more heavily on the findings and the use of our left hemisphere. And again, I would look at McGilchrist for an in-depth discussion of just how that plays out. This goes along with everything Blake saw as stemming from this new Lockean philosophy. He wanted to stop it before it got too far, before it infected language, the mind, and then art itself. And I put here, doesn't that remind you of someone? It reminds me just as Jordan Peterson. And if you should look at Jordan's talk to some art association in Canada, he expounds, I think, for a whole hour on the value of art to society, and it all comes from this. Blake was dead set against reflection on sensory input. Everything held in the memory, he said, is a shadow of its former self, or an abstraction. He thought of all abstractions as subtractions from the original. It is only through perception that we see and can employ our vision with a capital V. When Blake looked at the sun, he famously said that there I see an innumerable company of the heavenly host crying, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty." And there's a wonderful section in Fearful Symmetry where Fry expounds on this point of Blake's perception and the Guinea sun, the yellow disk in the sky, and how Blake sees it as a heavenly host. But I think that's going to stray too far from the topic at hand, but I do want to do a series of videos where I go over systematically Fearful Symmetry. So hopefully you can put all of that together. I've just given you sort of the bullet points of that. And so the missing link, as you might have guessed, is imagination. So as we move back to the beginning, Jordan says, reason starts to look like metaphor, like narrative. Yeah, it's imagination. Salmieri says the act of coming up with inertia is something else. Yeah, it's imagination. The cult of reason has so infected our language and in turn our minds. Remember, Jordan is battling he first got pretty famous over his battle over the pronouns, over the battle over a language, which he said is how we think. So it has in turn infected our minds that we seldom are able to even grasp the proper word for something other than reason when some intellectual process is being described. Jordan didn't think to use the word imagination, even though he has heavily relied on Fry in creating his Maps of Meaning book, who in turn relied and was heavily influenced by Blake. Imagination has been degraded to a childlike function, or a troperism, a Deepak troperism. To Blake, this is the furthest thing from the truth, however. In Blake's, and here's a few quotes just to give you again some bullet points and some ideas of what Blake thought. In Blake's psychology, imagination is not the ruler over desire and reason, but their source. And here's directly from Blake himself. Imagination is the divine vision, not of the world, nor of man, nor from man as he is a natural man, but only as he is a spiritual man. Imagination has nothing to do with memory. And then Fry says, imagination is constructive and communicable, whilst memory is circular and sterile. And Ian McGilchrist would have a lot to say about that as well, regarding the left hemisphere, as sort of the left hemisphere is sort of like a searchlight, a spotlight, and it is always looking at what it already knows. So when it looks across the landscape, it's ignoring everything that's out of everything that it's not familiar with, and it will only focus on the thing it already knows, therefore being circular and sterile. Whereas imagination constructs sort of the rest of the world that we don't know, or helps construct it. Damrosch is a famous Blake scholar, and so he says, memory is in Blake's view the symptom of a fragmented consciousness that interprets reality as a collection of discrete phenomena instead of a single form. Imagination has no need of memory because it perceives everything as simultaneous unity. That sort of reminds me of, let's say, the atomists would look at the world as just a bunch of discrete atoms that are somehow clumped together. And you'll see a lot of materialists say, well, you're just a clump of atoms or a clump of cells or whatever. Whereas Blake says that what you really should perceive is a unity. It's not just the particular atoms, but the whole. And this is something that what McGilchrist would say is right hemisphere specialization, that the right hemisphere sees the gestalt whole. Instead of seeing parts, so like seeing my eyes, my nose, my lips, my hair, my ears, and so forth, it sees me as a person. I'm a named person. The right hemisphere sees the individual. Instead of seeing perhaps a series of canyons, as the left would say, okay, classify, that's a canyon, that's a canyon, that's a canyon. This one, says the right hemisphere, is the Grand Canyon. I recognize it. It's individualized. So here I have a little schematic about how I view Jordan and Blake. My language is a little bit idiosyncratic. It's just the way I understand it, and I'll try to make it clear for you. So Blake he starts with sight, what we can see, and he kind of clumps in belief, hope, and vision into that as part of imagination, and that gets us to the unseen world. So that's his active perceiving, that we're creating sort of the world as it is to us. And Jordan, in his talk with Sal Mary, says, well, he sort of has a scientific way of saying it. Observation is perhaps how he would say it. And then there's a question mark. He doesn't know. There's a missing step. We observe, and then something happens, and then we come up with the idea of inertia. And then we have employed reason, math, and algorithms in that category. So obviously I'm making the case that the question mark here is imagination. As I've said, it's the missing link. And McGilchrist might say, if you're interested in McGilchrist, and again, this is just my way of thinking about it, that the left hemisphere is the reasoning hemisphere, although each hemisphere, it's complicated because each one, you might say reason is here, and so the left brings this part to reason and the right brings another part to reason, and they sort of enmesh to form reason.
They each do slightly different things. But let's just say the left hemisphere is a mathematical sense of reason, and it's very specific, and the right hemisphere is more imaginative, and it can get us to the general sense of things. And so McGilchrist gives this wonderful example. I don't know if it's in the book or if it was just in an interview, and it sort of helped me understand it in this way, because these are words he wouldn't quite use probably, but it makes sense to me. And so he says that there's a bird. I'm not sure if it's an actual bird that's been observed or if he's just trying to make an example. But the bird has before it a carcass, and it's picking at it. And so it will actually use its right eye, which is controlled by the left hemisphere, to see the food that is before it to eat. And so I would say that's like the specific daily task. It's that food right in front of you. And that's important to live. The bird needs that food to live. But the right hemisphere, now its left eye, controlled by the right hemisphere, is actively scanning the horizon. It's scanning everything around it, and so it gives rise. It's looking for predators. So without that left eye scanning the horizon for predators, the bird would die. It would not live very long. So that right hemisphere is sort of a non-specific. It's looking for non-specific threats, whatever might be out there, and that's important. To live well, if you take it into human standards, if you're going beyond just eating and breathing and so forth, the left it gives us tools that allow us to live, but the right, with imagination, allows us to live well. I think that's where you get religion. It sort of gives us the knowledge that we need to live a good life. And that's what Sam Harris is missing. He's all about just living, and in some sense, Jordan emphasizes living. He says both and. Jordan is both and, not either or, whereas Sam seems to be either or. Jordan's about living. Yes, we need to live. That's very important. Science gives us important tools to live, but we need to live well. Jordan says it's about survival of the species, survival of yourself, your family, your community, across time. And that's, I think, what's missing here. So to sum up, I'll give one more quote from Blake and a little bit of a closing statement there. Trembling I sit day and night, my friends are astonished at me. Yet they forgive me my wanderings. I rest not from my great task, to open the eternal worlds, to open the immortal eyes of man inwards, into the worlds of thought, into eternity, ever expanding in the bosom of God, the human imagination. O Savior, pour upon me thy spirit of meekness and love. Annihilate the selfhood in me. Be thou all my life. So clearly, imagination is no trivial thing to Blake, nor, I think, to Jordan Peterson, nor should it be to anybody. It allows us to see, to envision the possibilities in the world around us. And Jordan breaks this down very scientifically, which is why I think a lot of people are drawn to him, because he's not dismissing science. He's using science as a tool, as it should be. And he reaches all the way back to the motivational factors, found in mice, and famously the biochemistry found in lobsters, to inform us about our own human understanding and our own human imagination and how we perceive the world and how we act in the world. It's from this bottom-up approach that he arrives at much the same place that Blake reached from the top down. So Jordan, I think, is working from the bottom up, and Blake is sort of starting with God from the top and working his way down towards man through the imagination. And so the tree stump, as Jordan famously used, I think, in that exchange with Yaron, the tree stump is seen not just as a stump of wood, but as a possible chair, because we can imagine it so. Imagination is, in this sense, governing our reasoning and uses it as a tool instead of raising it up as a god. And I think there you have the strife between Jordan and Sam Harris. Reason is Harris. Harris is God. Reason is just a tool. Jordan is, I think he's putting imagination up there with God. If not God, it's hard to, you just refer back to the language about God. It's hard to talk about that in our third phase way of thinking. But there's definitely a case to be made that Jordan is putting imagination as the governor of reason, and that's where it should be. Reason is just a tool. Otherwise, you can get into scientism, and I think that's where Jordan says rational becomes rationalizing, and to distinguish the two becomes very difficult, and you basically pave your way to hell, as he demonstrates with the history of this Soviet Russia and so forth. So if you've liked some of this, please subscribe and let me know in the comment section. Thank you.